The war was consuming everyone, and I've definitely been here before, Lenson said, shocked by the terrible state his homeland was in. It's so different. I don't recognize everything, but there are villages I know, that's for sure. My village is about 100 kilometers from here. He pointed to the southwest. That's near Königsberg. I've been there a couple of times, and once I went to Krantz. It was raining. But we didn't care. He laughed. Neither the retreat nor the cold had any effect on Lenson. In his native land he was as if reborn from the ashes. But the disturbing silence in the village made him fearful. The villagers had fled the day before. There were 300 of us. From the march, which began at dawn, we were completely exhausted, sitting and waiting for the distribution of food. Only Lenson stood. He measured with his steps the length of the stable, against which the others leaned with their backs. Outside, the rain was dripping. Amidst the rather heavy explosions heard from the southeast came his voice. The sounds of fighting no longer affected us. They became the daily background of our lives, and we paid no attention to them, unless there was an immediate danger to us. We became like those people who cannot relax and enjoy life unless a tape recorder is blaring. Apparently they are afraid of real silence. Unfortunately, we were unable to turn off the noise, but we would have gladly done so. Except for Lenson's passionate ranting, everything was fine. About 30 meters away, 6 soldiers were cooking. The rest were just resting, eyes closed or staring into space. Autumn blew a damp freshness into our faces. We had been through so much suffering that we no longer felt anything that would normally make us feel despondent. We were almost unconscious, and paid no attention to the groans or to the suffering of others. The wounded were screaming and dying, but this did not prevent us from falling asleep at the first opportunity. We were given food sausages with soy puree sealed in cellophane, 1 for 2. Cold, obviously. During the retreat, those in charge of provisions had shown a miracle of dedication. They had collected so many old crumpled potatoes that it was enough to fill a motorcycle sidecar. They were now being distributed to the soldiers. Suddenly 4 of our comrades jumped over the fence. They were running at full speed and waving their arms. "Ivan," they shouted. We all, as one, rose from our seats. It became clear that in the next few moments we would face another battle. The expression of hunted animals froze on our faces. Those who had already had their portion of potatoes swallowed them. LT. Vollers joined us. His field radio, which he always kept close by, was transmitting an alarm. But we did not know the strength of the enemy. In a hurry, we put out patrols to see if we should resist or get away. 6 soldiers, those who were close to Wohlers, were sent outside the camp. One of them was me. 2 other companies were sent in other directions. Like everyone else, I was not so lucky. It felt as if we had been deprived of sleep for some unpleasant duty. We went behind the stables, where we had been until a few minutes ago, and found ourselves on a lawn where old logs were lying around. We should not have underestimated the danger. Out of desperation, we both hated death and sought it at the same time. The rifle weighed on my hands like a useless thing. There was no point in relying on it. There was a time when its weight, butt, and bayonet gave me confidence. But today, no matter what weapons you have, it is still impossible to organize a proper defense. We walked across the lawn to several buildings, split into 3s, and proceeded as cautiously as if we were carrying dynamite. We rounded the corner of a hut. In the distance we could see trees, and beyond them a road on which the soldiers were marching. And from afar the new companies were approaching. "There are at least 300 of them, or even all 4, whispered the soldier next to me. "Look at that." Behind the hut were barrels of tar. Trying not to make noise, we moved behind the barrels, and immediately found ourselves face to face with 4 Russian scouts. They also hid behind the barrels. The Russians did not take their eyes off us. There seemed to be a kind of lethargy on both sides. No one fired a shot, Eyes wide open, we looked at each other. With calculated movements, both we and the Russians withdrew under cover of the house. "Well, that's enough," Weiner muttered. "Let's go." It felt like we were dreaming. A quarter of an hour later, we were already digging trenches in the north of the village. According to intelligence, against us was an infantry regiment of 200 or 300 men. We were also 300, and there was no order to retreat. One after another, hours of tense waiting flowed by. We were accustomed to the Russians being slow, but we knew very well what a fierce attack we were facing. Toward evening, the Russians cautiously, taking advantage of the twilight, approached the huts. Now their infantrymen were not eager to rush headlong into battle, as at Belgorod or on the Dnieper. The Soviet High Command ordered them to abandon senseless heroism. Despite the desire for revenge and to capture German cities as soon as possible, the Russians realized that resistance would be desperate. They pinned great hopes on tanks and aircraft, believing that those would more quickly finish off our small, poorly armed formations. On the German side, too, it was now rare to see soldiers going into senseless attacks to battle cries. The Bolsheviks also fought European style, using techniques adopted from us. However, we were not relieved. Our platoon opened fire on a Russian patrol approaching us. We left the anti-aircraft guns for later. There were not enough shells. It was the first clash. To those accustomed to firestorms, it seemed insignificant. If something like this had happened anywhere in Paris, an entire city district would have been depopulated, and the newspapers would have made mind-boggling headlines. Every time has its own laws. The Russians, under cover of darkness and fog, were closing in on our positions. The thought that they were about to appear in front of us made me homesick. What if this evening was the last in our lives? 2,000 kilometers traveled, blood and fear, everything will come to a final end. Tonight might be the last night. We didn't know what to hope for. But the night passed quietly. From time to time, lights flashed. The Russians weren't in too much of a hurry. They watched us, and we watched them. I even managed to pine, though we had to guard continuously. Many others slept as well. Only the frost prevented us from resting properly. The dawn came. And then heaven and earth shook. Usually the rain muffled the sounds, but now we could clearly distinguish the movement of many tanks. The Russian infantry was calmly waiting for our destruction. We knew we were powerless against the tanks. We have no anti-tank guns, and grenades will not stop such a mass of tanks. My hair stood on end. We, as usual, in a hurry began to prepare for retreat. The motorcyclists were transmitting orders from the command. The guns were dragged on their arms. We could not let the Russians hear the noise of the engines. The company withdrew in a silence worthy of being depicted in a Hollywood movie about Indians. Only the cover soldiers remained, 3 platoons of 10 men each. The soldiers were given 2 anti-tank mines each. There were 2 soldiers in my platoon, Smelins and a kid specially trained to handle anti-tank mines. They were covered by me, Lindbergh, and 2 others of ours. For the first time I was appointed commander, I was given responsibility for the lives of 5 comrades. In the 2nd platoon, anti-tank mines had to put Lenson. Each platoon had an anti-aircraft gun, a heavy, clumsy one. There were only 18 shells for all of them. With the best of luck, we could stop 18 of the 60 to 80 tanks that were approaching us. Realizing the hopelessness of our situation, we froze with fear. LT. Vollers encouraged us. When 5 or 6 tanks catch fire, he said, it will demoralize the Russians, and in 24 hours we will return to the company. But no assurances could distract us from the simplest arithmetic calculations. Today, on this cursed day, it would seem it would be our turn. Our platoon listened to the last orders of the commanders, and the rest of the company followed us in silence. The rumbling of the tanks did not stop. Next to the veteran, I spotted Gals and went to shake their hands one last time. Deciding to give Gals something as a souvenir to send to my family, I searched my pockets, but found nothing. I had to limit myself to a wry grin. Voller's was gone. The squad split up. I was left alone with my platoon and my buddy Lindbergh's platoon. However, it was impossible to rely on such a friend. He all turned white with fear. I myself was also too young for the task assigned to me. Threw a quick glance at my subordinates. They were looking to the south, where the sound had come from. Lenson shouted something and pointed to a group of 4 or 5 buildings, probably a farm. We ran after him. The 3rd platoon began to look for cover on the road. The wind was getting stronger. It was snowing. The Russians began shelling the positions we had just left. Houses in a village about a kilometre away from us went up in flames. In a hurry, I sent 2 men to a position near the roots of uprooted trees. They began to dig a trench to protect themselves. We sought shelter nearby. The young explosive soldier was fearless and determined. Lindbergh and his partner rushed into a house 100 meters to the left. The Russians continued to pound the village. We were lucky to get away in time. We listened to the tanks slowly creeping toward us. It's so hard to wait for the battle to begin. The past flashed through my mind with devilish speed. I remembered my childhood and the war and Paula and all I had to do. I had a duty to fulfill, but there was too little time left to do it. We were torn by the opposite urge to flee or to throw ourselves into danger. No Bolshevik will be allowed to set foot on German soil, but here they are, here, and there are thousands of them. And we, called to stop them, are only 18 young men waiting for the miracle that will save them. But now the Russians are here. There were only 10 of them so far. They were coming along the road guarded by our 3rd platoon. Our soldiers did their duty, and we supported them, obeying the dictates of the heart. The first tank was stopped 20 meters from the location of the 3rd platoon. It was hit by a shell. The other cars began slow maneuvers. I shouted, "They're coming!" The tankers decided to take our anti-tank platoon by fright. They knew what a terrible impression the mere sight of armored monsters makes. Often only that was enough to decide the outcome of a battle. But the 2nd tank suffered the same fate as the 1st. The 3rd fell back, reached the German positions and broke the resistance of the platoon. With all their legs, the soldiers rushed away. They tried to hide in the woods, began to climb the hill, but the tank chased them literally on their heels. There was no one left alive. On the road, which an hour ago went infantry, now rumbling were advancing 10 or 12 tanks. But they were still too far away, and it was pointless to expect that we could stop them. 5 more tanks appeared. They were coming straight at the farm, ahead of which Lenson's platoon was entrenched. Lenson and his 2nd number opened fire on the tanks. Those were coming at a distance of 25 meters. They managed to hit 2 tanks. Explosions rumbled in the valley. The 3rd tank passed the wreckage of the first 2 and moved straight at us. Lenson's guys fired a 3rd shot. They didn't hit the tank, but they almost killed us. In the hut that was next to it, a fire went up. The explosion almost buried us alive. For a minute we were deaf. 3 tanks continued to move towards the farm, continuously shelling it. The crew must have decided that that was where our defences were concentrated, although they were out of range of our guns. But we opened fire anyway. Smellens fired at the tank, which was 200 meters away, and almost hit. The shell touched the ground, bounced, but never exploded. We wanted to draw attention to ourselves, and we succeeded. 1 tank came straight at us without stopping firing. I heard my soldiers screaming. They looked in horror at the huge machine that was crushing the wreckage of the house. But the tank suddenly stopped, turned and went back onto the road. And a little farther on, the Battle of David and Goliath continued. Lenson's squad was fighting 4 tanks that were firing all their guns. We heard Lenson's anti-aircraft gun fire its last shot. The tank closest to them spun and rammed the tank ahead of them. Amidst the smoke and fire, horrible screams were heard. Just above the trench where Lenson and his aide had taken shelter, a tank passed, spun around and was gone. So Lenson died, as he wanted, on the Prussian soil. For us, the nightmare continued. Although the tanks left, the infantry followed them. My comrade and I took cover in a trench, the other two behind tree roots. What had happened to Lindbergh and the sixth soldier? Obviously, I concluded, they died under the ruins of a building destroyed by the tank. And where are the remnants of Lenson's platoon? Maybe they, too, lay under the ruins of the farmhouse. All kinds of thoughts were running through my head. We are likely to be spotted on the grey soil, on which any silhouette stands out sharply. We could run into the pine forest. It is on the left, 300 meters away, but that would mean to be left without any cover. The Russians would spot me before I could get 10 meters away. There was a lot of smoke, but I could hardly escape behind it. I thought only of myself and realized that I had fallen into a trap from which there was no way out. I was so sure of this that I ordered the soldier lying next to me to shoot me. He had the same thought and stared fearfully into my face. "No way," he said. "No way. You better kill me. Please." The situation was tragicomic. We looked at each other with resentment and tried to shift the responsibility onto the other. "We're going to die anyway, you bastard," I shouted. "Shoot me. That's an order." No, I can't," he cried out in tears. "What, you're afraid to be alone?" "Yes." "Aren't you afraid? Don't you realize there's no other way out?" From the north, already behind us, we heard the sounds of fighting. "The Russians must have overtaken our company," I said. We looked at each other in silence and motionlessness. What to say? Everything had been said long ago. Then 2 soldiers appeared, hiding behind the trees, and soon Lindbergh appeared. He was carrying a wounded man. Among the ruins of the farmhouse we noticed figures moving rapidly. Cautiously they went into the woods about 200 meters away from us. "Let's run there and us," Lindbergh begged. "The Russians are close by." "It's easy to say," I responded. "Look at that, we'll have to go through without any cover." It was hard to argue with that. Everyone looked from the woods at the edge of the village to me. If only I had had the courage at that moment to inspire the others with the idea of possible rescue. But I was unable to cope either with the circumstances or with the soldiers who expected me to make a decision. Lenson's prophecy had come true. I was no commander. And my powerlessness was manifested right here, 100 meters away from the place where Lenson had died. I tried to think of something, but the situation was hopeless. I knew that my comrades would make the decision for me, which was mine to make. Am I really just a coward? Am I no better than Lindbergh, who was afraid in the open, knowing how much we despised him for it? I cursed my life, which had become a series of nightmares. On that day, at the decisive moment, I had lost my nerve. I had failed to live up to my own and others' expectations. My head was wobbling, like a drunk's head when gaiety is replaced by despair. I was fully aware of what was happening, but the panic so paralyzed me that I stopped thinking. And I'll never forgive myself for that. Time was running out, and it could have been used for the good of us all. Fear drove me into the abyss at the most crucial moment, in the midst of 5 soldiers on the verge of insanity. I no longer looked to see where the danger was coming from. I turned inward, but there I found only despair. We heard the rumble of a new group of tanks, the grinding of wheels, the rumble of engines. We were ready to scream with fear. Of overcoming himself, Lindbergh stood up. He wanted to know what was going on. He had lost his rifle, but he didn't think about defending himself. A crazy thought was born in his head. He bent over the edge of the trench. He had grenades clutched in his hands. Again there was the rumble of large-caliber guns. and then a truck appeared from somewhere and machine guns started talking. We stared at each other in silence, not believing our ears. We heard German speech. Someone looked into the trench. It was a German officer. Probably he thought we were all dead and went away. But in a couple of minutes we were pulled out by 2 tankers. The German troops did launch an offensive. It was led by 2 SS armored regiments that hit the Russians in the rear and caused them heavy damage. We even took a village for a couple days before another retreat began. In Pillau we stayed for 3 weeks. We were declared unfit for military service. We were all wounded and semi-conscious, hardly able to grasp what was going on. We did not understand orders. However, no one was going to expel us from the army. There was a large influx of refugees in Pillau, so those who had a pair of arms and legs left did not sit idle. The first aid squads called us into their ranks. Those who were much more severely wounded were also included. There were so many problems that there was not enough manpower. There were many wounded soldiers brought in from near Königsberg and Kranz. They were lying everywhere, often right in the yard. It was January cold, which sometimes even without medical help could end their suffering. Ships were on their way to Pillau. They were packed with people. Most of them were refugees, and the remaining places were occupied by the wounded. They were divided into 2 parts. In the first were those who were so badly wounded that it was useless to take them anywhere. They were not taken aboard. They were finished. Those who weren't quite hopeless were taken to the ships. If they were lucky, they would get to Germany. And there, we thought, there would be complete peace. For every 1,000 evacuees, there were 3,000 new arrivals from the Eastern Front. They joined the ranks of those who needed help. If the front line had reached Pillau, what happened in Memel would have happened again, only in a worse way. There were many more people here. They came here from Heiligenbeil, Pommerendorf, Elbing, and even from Prussian Holland. There were rumors that in Pillau they would be taken on a steamer. We talked with the wounded and refugees. Each of them had lost someone close to them on the way. In trembling voices they told us what we had already seen in Memel. From them we learned that the horrors of Memel were repeated in almost all the coastal towns of Prussia. We could barely stay on our feet and looked enviously at the crowds of people who would gradually drift away to their promised safe zone. Despite their best efforts, it was clear that they would not get even a tenth of what they hoped for. If God had heard their prayers, the heavens would have opened and helped them in their distress. But God remained deaf to their suffering, and only a weeping child asleep could forget what he had suffered. Toward the end of winter, a sudden cold snap came. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The suffering of the refugees increased, and the deaths became even greater. There was a crowd outside a large building full of people. The smell of food being cooked in camping conditions emanated from the building. Those outside were stamping their feet to keep warm. The stomping of feet resembled the muffled beat of drums. The children were the worst hit. Someone was lost, and when he got tired of calling for his mother, he cried, and no one could stop him. They were the youngest. They didn't understand what was happening. Their faces, with tears frozen in the frost, are forever imprinted in my memory. We tried to gather them under the roof by the boilers to keep them warm. We pelted them with questions, and then, over the loudspeaker, we began our search. A little farther up on a hill, covered with ice, stood a large metal cross. It resembled a huge sword stuck into the ground. The cross became like a symbol of grief. Those who believed in God gathered around it. They prayed together with the priest. The frost was getting worse. The bay had frozen over, and now the ships in Pillau couldn't get through. But this situation had a downside. Thousands upon thousands of refugees were making their way across the ice to the narrow strip of land and heading towards Danzig. Soviet bombers bombed the ice to make movement difficult. Trucks and wagons disappeared under the ice floes. But nothing could stop the refugees. They were prepared to do anything. In this section, the Russians were making more and more progress. It looked like Königsberg had surrendered. Gradually, there was less work to do. We began to plan the evacuation of everyone who was not really needed. Pillow was 12 miles from Königsberg. The front line in the Kranz area was also shrinking. It was to be expected that fighting would soon boil over here as well. We were now part of that tiny reserve which had been formed from the remnants of destroyed and disbanded units. And yet we had to fight by the rules. No one knew where the rest of Greater Germany was, but our tattered uniforms still bore the patches with the name of the division, and there were many old acquaintances with me, Lieutenant Wohlers, who had a dirty bandage on his right arm, Pergam, the disillusioned Pastor Schlesser Lindberg, who could overcome his fear, and our cook, Gransk, who had long since replaced the pots and pans with a machine gun. My friend Gals, whom I shall never forget, was also here, as well as 8 other men whom I did not know by name. Altogether, we made up the remnants of the Greater Germany division. Couldn't we have been written off? I don't think so. An officer greeted us. We stood at attention and studied the grey face of the captain, who still demanded strict discipline. We used to be annoyed by the petty nagging, the need for discipline in everything. Now we even found some joy in it. After all, discipline was demanded only from those who were still able to fight. We did not go into further analysis. And that was enough for us. We had long ago got used to living today. The captain spoke to us, but despite the official tone, we realized that he was carrying the same load as all of us officers, soldiers, men, women, children. The time when officers shouted at us was a distant past. Now, circumstances did not permit unnecessary rudeness. The captain spoke to us as a man speaks to a man, but he wore a uniform. And that obliged him, even in such a dire situation as ours, to keep order. He knew, like the rest of us, that our case was lost, but he was grasping at the last straw. The captain said we'd have to retreat. We'll have to march across the ice to Danzig, where our division remains. In a tone that was not at all unappealing, he said that we, when we reach our destination, still have to fight. In giving his orders, however, he did not seek to conceal the worst from us, for it was impossible to hide from him. Having informed us of further plans, the captain went to the next platoon, having already taken under his visor on the way. So we set off. Wind gusts lifted flakes of snow from the mirror surface of the ice. The sea was splashing in the distance, and the noise of war could be heard behind us. In the evening we reached Fritschenierung and the first bomb shelters, which were almost invisible under the snowdrifts. On top of that, I slipped and sprained my leg. I had to walk another 60 kilometers. And what to do? I had long known that fate had turned against me. But so many people had suffered and died here that my worries did not count. We moved slowly. We took shelter wherever we could, even in an upside-down boat. We were not the only ones who thought of this. There were several refugees already here, shivering from the cold. They groaned as they tried to sleep. By the middle of the next day, we reached Karlberg. The town had nowhere to turn from the refugees. They found no food here. Powdered milk went to the children. The soldiers also had to wait in long lines. They received 2 handfuls of flour per person and a cup of boiling water diluted with a tiny portion of tea. We continued the tedious journey, meeting refugees everywhere. Twice we began to be bombed by Soviet airplanes. I was most afraid for the children, who could not understand what was happening. They did not know that enemy planes were hovering over them. They did not understand the danger of hunger and cold. A trap awaited them at every turn. They were threatened from the air, but it was no easier on the ground. Their arms and legs ached. Every step made them bite their lips, and they sank into a state of continuous fear. After 3 days, we reached Danzig. The city was calm, despite the fact that there were several thousand refugees there. The front was to the south, and we did not even hear the rumble of guns, although air raids on the center of the city were not infrequent. Danzig became a staging post for the refugees. Although huge crowds spent days and nights homeless, Everything possible was done to alleviate their plight. There was railroad access to the west, and steamships were leaving the port. We were left waiting on the wharf, among a dense crowd of these willy-nilly tramps. Vollers went to the redistribution center to find out where our unit was. He waited under the glass roof for hours. I was in no hurry to leave my boots, frozen in the cold, cut into my swollen ankles. A large steamer entered the harbour. The crowd rushed to the wharf. The ship had not yet given up its moorings, so we had to wait a few more hours, but wasting time was of no consequence in Danzig. People were grasping at straws and willing to endure anything. We had already been waiting 2 days for news and instructions under the glass canopy of the station. The wind was raging. Its gusts shattered the remnants of the glazing. It was no warmer inside than outside. To keep warm, I had to walk non-stop and wave my arms. Since I was almost unable to walk, my comrades gave me a corner in the station room, while they walked around the ruins in the harbour. At last the news reached us, though not quite as we had expected. There are no units of the Greater Germany Division in Danzig. Perhaps they were transferred to Gottengaffen, located a few kilometers north in the bay. It's not far to walk, but will my legs hold up? Leaning on both a stick and gals, I could hardly walk halfway across the city, but Providence itself helped us. The locals came out to meet us and took us into a house. It was warm. It seemed to us that the gates of paradise had dissolved before us. Although the house was crowded without us, the owners offered us a bath. Vollers knew that soldiers had no right to the amenities of refugees, but his uniform had turned to rags. He was so tired he didn't refuse. Even I washed my swollen ankle in a basin of hot water. Our hosts insisted that we stay the night and even fed us in the evening. We spent the night in the warm basement. Unfortunately, we were so used to the warmth that we could not even appreciate it enough. Several times we were shivering, as if some alarm were going off inside. Finding ourselves suddenly at rest, we realized to the end that we were barely alive from exhaustion. Lindbergh had a fever from time to time. Gals had completely collapsed. He did not want to sleep lying down and spent the night leaning against the wall, sobbing all the time. I was stretched to my full height, but with every breath I took, I was in pain. Would we never be able to feel like normal people again? Quite possibly. It wasn't all bad, though. I felt that my legs felt much better after the hot bath. We didn't take care of ourselves at all. And as soon as we practiced the simplest hygiene, there was a miraculous cure. Even a badly wounded man was revived with a sip of schnapps and a kind word. Today, a healthy man is knocked out of the saddle by a common cold. Of course, we weren't supermen, but men in the full sense of the word. In the morning, we said goodbye to our benefactors. They said that their forces were also running out and they were going to leave Danzig for the west before it was too late. The air raid began. Under the explosions and the roar of engines, we resumed our journey to Gottengaffen. Along with us were crowds of refugees heading west. Danzig was no longer a safe city. Some of the refugees were heading north to Gelle, the port opposite Gottengaffen, which was no less crowded than Danzig. In the month before the destruction, Gottengaffen had been a collection point for the wounded, who were then sent to villages inland. The next stopping point was Gelle, which was 50 kilometers from Gottengaffen. The soldiers we met along the way were pelted with questions, but no one knew where our unit was. They couldn't help us at the assembly point either. The officials were at their wits' end. The terrible news spread as a result of an underwater attack a few days ago. A large steamship packed with refugees sank. I could easily imagine the explosion of the steamer in the dark, among the ice. Officially, the news was not made public, but the crowd somehow learned of the incident, for the sea was the last hope for each of the refugees. It was said that the name of the sunken steamer was Wilhelm Gustloff. We could not find out anything about our unit. In the end, we were enlisted in a battalion and sent together with the locals to build a defense line. We went about 20 kilometers inland. I, of course, did not know where the enemy was, but it seemed to me that we prepared the defense in the wrong direction. Anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns were aimed to the west and southwest, the only directions of retreat. I couldn't understand anything. But what, after all, did I care? Not for the first time I found myself perplexed. So what? Others are thinking for us. Although there were plenty of refugees here in the village, life was easier. The Prussian peasants, though with frightened faces, continued to work with the same diligence. The future was shrouded in gloom for them. They may have been lucky before, but they were unlikely to be lucky now. Although the authorities had given orders to avoid panic and carry on with normal life, the peasants were secretly destroying supplies so that they would not fall to the enemy. Cattle were slaughtered. The future showed that the peasants were not wrong. A little time passed, and the surviving animals fell by the hundreds on the frozen ground. Despite the hard work and the need to carry a guard, the food was good, and we pulled ourselves together at least a little. What helped us most was the meat. The war was consuming everyone and everything. And we are meat. Gransk returned to his old duties. With the help of civilian volunteers, he set up a kitchen under the canopy. 2 trucks ran between Tiesopot, Gottengafen and Danzig. From here food was sent to the front lines, transported in small shipments. With the exception of a few raids, life was remarkably quiet, which was contrary to the situation, because it was the beginning of 1945. Even the frost had subsided. We were afraid to look at the heavens that showered us with untold favors. We had to work hard to meet our daily needs, but this labor did not seem so tiresome. But then, somewhere around the end of February, we were called to Gottenhafen. We thought that the Greater Germany Division had ceased to exist. But it didn't. The brass formed several units to send them west. Everything seemed to be going for the best. We parted with the battalion to which we were assigned, said goodbye to our new comrades. It was painful to leave the kitchen, in the creation of which so much effort had been invested. But it turned out that leaving here saved our lives. Russian tanks were moving in from the west. Shells whistled over the barrier positions we had built. Our battalion withstood the first blow, but soon it was pushed back. The Russians also suffered heavy losses, but as we already knew, they sought victory at any cost. In the bloody fighting that ensued, the battalion was completely annihilated. Heaven, which we had cursed so much, decided to spare us this time. In Gottenhafen, where we were awaiting further orders, the noise of the battle breaking out could be heard. The Russians managed to break through to a distance of 10 kilometers from the city. Heavy fighting ensued. Under bursts of shells, the refugees entrenched in the vicinity made their way to the city. Advanced positions of the Soviet troops were exposed to fire from German warships. The ground was shaking. The last panes of glass were flying out. We tried to reason with the refugees, who at all costs sought to sail to Gela. Retreating troops were arriving in the city. It became clear that the barrier positions of the enemy is not a hindrance. Panic broke out in Gottengafen. The refugees rushed to the port. They finally undermined the organization, which even before we managed to keep with great difficulty. Although we all had evacuation papers, we were again moved, this time to close the gap at Tiesopot. We left Gottengafen in despair. My mouth was dry and my heart was jumping out of my chest. We loaded into civilian buses and travelled to a new Golgotha. Through the closed windows we looked into the sky, in which, like wasps, were flying bombers. In Breslau we got out of the cars and walked among the ruins. Explosions rumbled everywhere. The Russians were firing rockets and bombs at any moving target. Their planes were flying so low that we could see the pilots' faces. We loaded back into the buses and set off again, trudging through the dust. The road was completely destroyed. Several times we had to clear the way by filling in huge shell craters, otherwise we would have gotten completely stuck in them. Finally, the buses stopped at the edge of some village. 15 kilometers south of us there was the rumble of guns. We ran up to a hedge near where a motorcycle was parked, hoping to get directions, but the passengers of the motorcycle had been shot dead. The driver's head fell on the handlebars and his back turned into a bloody mass. The second military man seemed to have fallen asleep. The bursts of shells sounded closer and closer. It never occurred to us that the Russians were near. Where were our troops? Finally, we saw them. We climbed over the hedge and found ourselves on a flat lawn. It was being shelled by large caliber guns, leaving puffs of smoke after each shot. We had to get to the hill, no matter what. We all had orders in our pockets. With a few short throws, which no one had ever taught us, we reached the positions. The machine gun barrels of half-track German vehicles, assembled from different squads, were aimed at 20 Soviet tanks standing motionless on the ground. The soldiers, all in the mud, took cover in hastily dug trenches. No sooner had we jumped down than a shot rang out, then an explosion was heard, and everything was enveloped in thick smoke that drifted to the ground. The machine guns from the vehicles that were in cover also opened fire. The Russian tanks still remained in place, but they too began firing. We managed to hit a few tanks. Flames were bursting out of their loopholes. Then came the inhuman order: since the enemy's tanks were not coming at us, we must move out to meet them. With a few throws we overcame a couple of meters. The firing did not cease. The soldier walking next to me fell down. We lost the remnants of self-control and gradually came closer and closer. After each throw we fell to the ground. The tanks were unaccompanied and therefore could not take accurate aim. One tank, which was about 60 meters from our trench, caught fire. 3 vehicles moved toward us. If they passed over the rampart that protected us, the war would be over for us in a minute. I can still see those tanks now, the metallic thud and sight of the machine gun, my fingers resting on the trigger. With each passing second, as the tanks approached, the ground on which I lay transmitted to me the vibration of their progress, and my nerves, which had been strained to the limit, seemed to begin to emit an extended groan. I realized again that it was possible to live my life in a few seconds. I saw the yellow headlights of the tank, and then everything disappeared. I pulled the trigger and the fire scorched my face. My brain was paralyzed. It was like it was made of the same material as my helmet. The flashes of the machine guns firing nearby blinded me, and by inertia I opened my eyes wide, though I couldn't see anything because of the smoke. And then the second tank burst into flames. He was hit by 3 shells. We frantically grabbed the muzzle of the gun, jabbed into the sky to the left of the burning tank. A rumbling sound reached us. A third tank was crossing the hill behind our position. It increased its speed and was now about 30 meters away from us. I grabbed the last grenade. One of my comrades fired. For a few moments I was blinded. Then I saw a tank covered with mud approaching us. Then there was an explosion as violent as if a volcano had erupted. The tank was thrown upwards. There was thick smoke all around. There were no more tanks. We got out of the shelter. The Russians couldn't stand our diabolical persistence and drove their tanks away. We threw ourselves on the icy ground. It seemed so soft to us. The tanks are gone, but they will appear again. There is no doubt about it. They will appear with reinforcements, accompanied by airplanes and artillery. And our present stubbornness would be useless. We continued to fight, despite the superiority of the enemy, with which we could do nothing. And we fought for a reason. At least the masses of refugees were saved. During the night, spent without sleep, others joined us. We rebuilt our positions, set up a minefield, which was made possible by the arrival of ammunition from Danzig. The mines were an invaluable aid to defense, but they exploded only once. It was clear that before entering the ground, the Russians would conduct a bombardment with large caliber guns. Over the course of 3 days, the Russians repeatedly launched a powerful attack in the bay to cut Danzig off from Gottengaffen. Fergam was severely wounded. We retreated again, but with the support of naval artillery. Had not the Russians turned out in such numbers and with so many guns, would have had to retreat them. The remnants of the German troops spread out in a small area. Air raids did not stop. Looking at the horizon, we saw nothing alive. Only 6 months ago there had been a peaceful life here, but now the apocalypse had come to this land. It was impossible to go outside during the day. Airplanes were constantly flying in the sky. In spite of our air defenses, more and more planes were flying. Our positions were weakened. The evacuation of troops began. We were among the first to return to Gottengaffen. In some areas of the city was already simmering battle. Its appearance had completely changed. You could see ruins everywhere. The air smelled of fires. The wide streets that led to the docks were now dead ends. The buildings lining them were blocking the way. We had to clear the rubble so that refugee trucks could reach the harbour. Every 5 to 10 minutes enemy planes appeared, and we had to stop work. Several times a day there was a fire in the street. Only the memories of Belgorod and Memel prevented us from committing suicide. We stopped counting the dead and wounded. Those who were not wounded, there were none. Horses pulled wagons with the dead wrapped in rags or just paper. They should have been buried, but the I Love machine guns did not allow this to be done. In the middle of the ruins stood people. They were a perfect target for the Russian pilots. The horizon in the west and southwest became maroon from numerous fires. Street fighting had begun on the outskirts of the city. Thousands of refugees were still waiting on the wharf. From time to time, Russian shells reached it and burst. We took a break in the basement where the doctor was delivering babies. The basement was covered with a vault. The only lighting was kerosene lamps. Usually the birth of a child is a joyous occasion. Now it was only part of a great tragedy. No one paid attention to the mother's cries. There were too many similar cries everywhere. And the child was already regretting being born. Blood flowed again. It flowed over the land that had brought us so much suffering. I re-evaluated human life again. Now I began to think of it as a mixture of blood and endless agony. After a while, after looking at the newborn, whose cries were no more audible in war than the clinking of crystal in peacetime, we returned to the street, where the fires were still raging. For the child's sake, we hoped that death would catch up with him before he turned 20. 20 is a thankless age. It is hard to leave life in its prime. We helped old people who had been abandoned by the young. Darkness fell, but it was illuminated by the light of the fires. We brought the old people to the harbour, where a steamer was waiting for them. After leading the old men through the crowd, we put them on the trawler. To avoid the air attack, the ship had to zigzag around the port water area. A new raid began, and new lives were lost. We were just getting off the steamer when Vollers appeared. He chewed his lip and then asked, "Do you still have the passes with you?" We pulled out crumpled, dirty passes. "I'd rather lose my head than a pass," Gransky muttered. "Well, stay on deck." The water flowed peacefully a meter below us. If there was an overload, the ship might sink. But no one lifted a finger. Once again, we escaped the wrath of the Russians. When we reached Jella without incident, it was not yet dawn. Several ships passed by us, seeming to be ghosts. They sailed without lighting their lights. They were either returning to Gela or going to Gottenhafen, or perhaps to Danzig, where many civilians were waiting for transportation. I thought Gela was a big city. It turned out to be a simple village, and its port was of no strategic importance. Ships were anchored off the coast, and civilians fleeing to the west were leaving in small boats. No sooner had we set foot on the shore than we were rounded up by the gendarmes. We kept our eyes on them. Would our luck change now? When we were almost saved, would they send us back to Danzig or Gottengaffen? But the gendarmes had turned their backs on us. They were busy with the civilians. There's nothing to worry about. Our papers are in order. But shouldn't we continue our voyage on this steamer? And what if another order was about to come? The minutes passed slowly, and we did not know what to do. At dawn, the fatigue that had been accumulating for months seemed to come over us again. In the light of day, we could see the silhouettes of steamships. Among them were many warships. They were anchored on both sides of the peninsula. Then a siren blared. An air attack. We raised our heads, and there was an uproar in the crowd. "Don't panic. The gendarme roared, our air defense units will deal with the bombers in no time." Now we knew what those words meant. The bomb shelters are full of wounded, so everyone must take care of themselves. If a single bomb explodes near the harbour, there'll be plenty of blood. We rushed to the old ship's hulk. Maybe we could hide from the bombing behind it. No sooner had we reached it than the shells of anti-aircraft guns whistled around us. The anti-aircraft guns on the shore and on the warships were firing barrages. I had never experienced such a thing. Shell fragments could do as much damage as enemy bombs. In the east, countless black dots appeared in the sky. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire. 3 bombers appeared. There was an explosion over the water. One of the planes must have retaliated. The gendarme didn't exaggerate, not a single plane flew to Gela. There was confidence that we had finally succeeded in stopping the Russians. The gendarme came over, took the documents. "You must return on March 31st, the officer told us. "In the meantime, go to the north. There you will have something to do." We set off without asking any questions. "What day is today?" Gals asked. "Wait a minute," said Wallers thoughtfully. "I have a calendar in my notebook." He rummaged in his pocket, but found nothing. "Are we here too early?" "Still, we need to know what day it is," Gals persisted. "I've got to know how long we're going to be here." Eventually we found out that it was Sunday, March 28th or 29th. We would have to wait 2 days, the last 2 days on the Eastern Front, and how many more of us would die in those 2 days? We have spent the last of our time in the company of desperate refugees whose camp was on a narrow strip of the Gela coast. The Russians launched 2 more air attacks. The last victim of the raid was a skinny white horse. We managed to shoot down the plane. It was falling to pieces right in the air. We watched it fall to the ground with a roar. The horse became furious and bit its reins and galloped straight to where the remains of the plane were flying. That's where death caught up with it. On the evening of April 1st, the weather was terrible. We were put on a large white steamship on which once travelled the rich. It was an imposing ship with ostentatious luxury. I remembered the shop windows. My father always took me to see them at Christmas. But I tried not to show my joy. I knew it would end badly. The steamer sailed leisurely through the waves in the darkness. Long after we had sailed, we could still hear the rumble of battle in Danzig Bay. Our comrades were still fighting and dying there. We were afraid to even think how lucky we were we had been saved. For 2 days the steamer sailed on the sea. It was heading for the west, which we had despaired of seeing. We had been dreaming about it for so long, and we could not imagine that we would return. We learned the name of the steamer, the Pretoria. Although we were given a tiny space on the deck, where the wind was blowing and the water was pouring in, everyone even forgot about food. Of course, any second a torpedo could hit us and we would go down. But no one tried not to think about that. We were escorted by a warship. Everything was going just fine. Finally, we arrived in Denmark. Here we saw pictures we hadn't seen in a long time. We looked at the pastry shops with amazement. On our dirty faces, despair was replaced by a childlike expression. Our appearance certainly didn't inspire confidence in the shopkeepers, but we didn't care about that. They didn't understand what we wanted. We had no money, and no one was going to give us the goods for free. Sometimes we even thought of using the vending machines. Gals just couldn't take it anymore. He stretched out his hands like a withered tree and begged for alms. The shopkeeper pretended that nothing was happening, but Gals did not give up. Finally, the shopkeeper put a withered cake in his unwashed hands. gals divided it among the four of us. We savoured the long-forgotten delicacy. We thanked the shopkeeper and smiled. But our grin was more like a grimace. The shopkeeper thought we were mocking him. He hurriedly disappeared into the store. He didn't know how long we hadn't been able to smile. Now we have to learn it all over again. We arrived in Kiel on a less luxurious boat, but here the atmosphere was more familiar. We didn't see any candy stores and there was no need to smile. We were hastily formed into a battalion right there among the ruins. Gals asked if he could have a leave of absence to go home to Dortmund. A soldier in his 50s patted him on the shoulder and said, "If you have the nerve and you will be lucky, you may be able to penetrate the defences of the Americans and British." On the face of Gals reflected despair. So they're here already. This is how the West met us. We dreamed of it for a long time and finally got there. And this is the news we get. We couldn't recover from our amazement. In Memel, on the Dnieper, and on the Don we had dreamed for so long of the West, of this earthly paradise where our sufferings would end. Only the thought of it helped us to survive. But it turned out to be just a piece of land, on which houses stand. The silence is broken by the roar of airplanes, and scared-to-death residents are fleeing. Here it is the West, 3 dusty trucks, packed with a hastily recruited battalion of soldiers in grey gymnasies. They are on their way to a new duel with death. It was then that my last illusions disappeared. Instead of helping, the whole West turned against us. Against the exhausted soldiers, who had almost no weapons left, the armies of several countries, among them France. I can't even tell you what thoughts this news awakened in my mind. France alone, I thought, had not betrayed me. Sitting in a trench somewhere in the steppe, I continued to adore France, as a young man who leads revolutionary conversations in a Parisian café adores it. And then sweet France betrayed my naive dreams. I fought for France. I made my comrades love her as I did. What happened? France, from whom I expected help, has sided with the enemy. I would have to shoot the French, whom I considered brothers like Gals or Lindbergh. What happened? What had been withheld from us? I no longer understood or knew anything. My brain refused to think. The West was my last hope, and now it was dead. We have to fight again, but against whom? Against what? We had no morale left and we had lost all hope. The British and Americans were giving victory shouts, but no matter how hard they tried, we paid no attention to them. How can one defeat a man for whom everything around him has died? We reached the banks of the Elbe and encamped by the road that led to Lauenburg. English troops were operating in this sector. Our task was to fight them back. A veteran was handing out food to us. Fate had wanted to feed us. Gals stepped aside. There was emptiness in his eyes. He mumbled something to himself, but the veteran didn't seem too upset. He whispered to me, "With any luck, the war will be over in a few days." What do you mean over? What's he talking about? I knew that when a war ends, the losers end up with a hole in the head or a punctured chest. That's not what I mean, said the veteran. We'll get captured. You'll see. It's not much fun, but it's better than dodging shells. Remember what I said. These guys aren't some Russian men. They're decent guys. The night passed. It was warm, almost like daytime. We sat on the damp grass by the roadside. We could hear airplanes buzzing in the sky. But in 3 years of enforced sleeplessness, we had become so accustomed to dozing off in spite of the raids that we didn't care. By 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a rumble of artillery somewhere to the north. Flares flashed in the sky. The battle lasted 3/4 of an hour, but we continued to doze off. Dawn came early. The sun appeared above the horizon. A wrecked all-terrain vehicle bounced along the potholes on the road, brown in colour. The uniforms of the 3 soldiers in it were clearly not German. We watched in silence as 3 red-cheeked guys in ridiculously large helmets approached us. It was clear from their faces that they were pleased with themselves. That's how I first met the English. It was pointless to shoot at these smug morons, but some asshole dared and fired 2 shots. He was aiming for the head. The rover turned sharply to the side, but the British acted so clumsily that we could have wiped them out 20 times over. The veteran shouted at the young imbecile, who was only doing his duty. He said that now there will be motorized units, and then we are finished. The captain decided to intervene, but then he changed his mind and went back to the gun. An hour later, the sound of engines was heard to the north of us. The veteran was right. A spy plane flew over us. It aimed its fire directly at the road. We threw ourselves on the ground and, like caterpillars, crawled into the ravine. So we were saved from 50 mortar shells, which could greatly reduce our ranks. The British, apparently, decided that our spirit was finally broken, and the matter would be limited to a few shots. They sent 4 motorcycles after us. We watched with some fear as the motorcycles climbed up the hill. 2 of us stood up with our hands raised. Nothing like this had ever happened on the Eastern Front. Now we waited to see what would happen next. Would the machine gun fire hit them? Would our commander open fire in retaliation for their deaths? But nothing happened. The veteran, who was nearby, grabbed my hand and whispered, "Let's go." Sick. We both stood up. The others followed us. Gals came over and stood next to us. He had no intention of raising his hands. We were closing in on the winners. My heart was pounding with fear. My mouth was dry. It was the first time I was afraid of the Allies. The British soldiers, a vengeful look on their faces, had herded us all together. But we had seen worse in our own army, such as during our training under Captain Fink. There was nothing unusual in the rudeness with which the English treated us. That is how I laid down the arms of one of my own kin. That's how the war ended for me and my comrades. To humiliate us more, the British made us ride in trucks standing up, and they were shaking continuously. But they couldn't understand why we were laughing and joking. Gals got a slap from an English officer. He didn't even realize what was going on. He was just comparing how hard we had traveled to the Eastern Front and in what comfort we returned. We met with other allies as well. They were tall, rosy-cheeked, chubby, behaving like bullies but well-mannered. Their uniforms were made of soft fabric, like a tracksuit, and they moved their jaws continuously as if they were chewing gum. They didn't express joy at winning, nor did they look upset. They didn't care. They were just doing their tiresome chores. We looked at them curiously. Perhaps from the outside one might have thought that we, the defeated side, had gone to heaven. What they lacked was joy. The Americans, of course, humiliated us in every possible way. They housed us in a camp of tents, crammed to capacity. But even as prisoners of war, the Wehrmacht soldiers continued to keep order. So it was at Kharkov, on the Dnieper, at Memel, and in Pillow, and in the steppe. The sick and wounded slept under the canopy. The Americans, of course, subjected us to all kinds of humiliation. They housed us in a camp of tents packed to capacity. But even as prisoners of war, the Wehrmacht soldiers continued to keep order. So it was at Kharkov, on the Dnieper, at Memel, and in Pillow, and in Pestep. Under the canopy slept the sick and wounded. In the center of the camp, the Americans opened crates filled with canned food. Kicking them up with their foot, they dumped the canned goods on the ground and stepped back, leaving us to distribute the food ourselves. We were so hungry that we forgot both the humiliation and the rain that had turned the ground into a mush. The height of luxury was powdered lemonade. We filled our pockets with water and mixed powder. The Americans looked at us and chatted among themselves. They were probably thinking how quickly we had agreed to surrender and submit to the conditions of confinement, such as serving food in the rain. Shouldn't we have walked in silence, with grim faces, like all those whose pride had been wounded? We didn't look at all like the Germans from the movies shown to our jailers before we were sent away. There was nothing to be angry about. We were not bloodthirsty Boches, but simply starving people who would soak in the rain just to get some canned meat. We were half dead, with fear imprinted on our faces, exhausted and sleepless. We didn't demand any courtesy, we just needed a few hours of sleep. A little more time passed and we were sent to Mannheim for filtration. Gals, Gransk, Lindbergh and I never parted, as we stuck together even in moments of danger. One thing was clear to us: the war was over for us. We didn't think about the consequences. Too much had happened, and we could not orient ourselves in the situation. But we knew that the worst was over. Now former German soldiers are being reorganized. The Allies would count the prisoners and tell us what to do with them. The reorganization was assisted by our officers, who walked in rags through the rows among the freshly dressed victors. The prisoners of war were given cigarettes, some even got gum. They chewed it, laughed and swallowed it. Then we received our orders and began to form into squads. Are we to be sent to the front again? But that's impossible. Feldspel, who from all that happened completely dumbfounded, barked to the squad. Take up arms. In response, there was an explosion of laughter. The Americans went completely mad. They came out and started yelling at us. We did not understand anything, but it became clear we must behave properly. The lieutenant took his visor and froze, waiting for a reprimand. Some time later, the prisoners of war were examined by a doctor. Some were sent to the hospital, some were sent to the officers. They enrolled them in clearing squads. Everyone was checked by a special commission, which usually consisted of representatives of various countries of the anti-Hitler coalition: Canadians, British, French, Belgians. My papers went to a Frenchman. He looked at me twice, then spoke in German. Are your date and place of birth correct? What? Yes, I answered, this time in French. My father is French. Now I spoke French with as much difficulty as I had spoken German in Chemnitz. The interlocutor looked at me incredulously. After a moment's silence, he spoke again, now in French. So it turns out you are French? I didn't know what to say. For 3 years the Germans had convinced me that I was German. I guess so, Herr Major. What do you mean, probably? I was completely confused and silent. So why are you fighting in the enemy's ranks? I don't know, Herr Major. What are you talking about, Herr Major, Herr Major? What the hell do you mean, Herr Major? Call me Herr Captain. Come with me. He got up. I followed him. In the dirty rows of green overcoats, I recognized Gal's gaze. I waved to him and spoke softly. Gals, stay here. I'll be right back. Who are you talking to? The captain asked irritably. This is my friend, Mr. Captain. I couldn't get into French. Stop speaking German. Have you completely forgotten French? Come here. I followed him down endless corridors, afraid I wouldn't be able to find Gals again. At last we came to an office of some kind. 4 Frenchmen were talking to a woman. She seemed to be speaking to them in English. The captain said we had a problem. I was questioned at length, but they didn't find the answers too convincing. My head was splitting. No one listened to my excuses. One officer called me a bastard and a traitor, but I didn't resent it. In the end, they got fed up with me. They sent me to a room downstairs. There I spent the whole day and the whole night. I thought of my companions, especially of Gals. He was sitting there wondering where I had gone. I had a premonition that I would never see him again. I could not sleep with excitement. The next morning, a friendly-looking lieutenant came to fetch me. I was conducted to the same office as the day before and asked to sit down. Such courtesies came as a complete surprise to me. I acted as if I were being treated as a human being for the first time. The young lieutenant looked at my papers and spoke. Yesterday we did not know what to do with you. We know that the Nazis forced those whose father was German to serve in the army. In such a case we should have left you in a prisoner of war camp for some time. But you have a German mother. That doesn't give us any reason to detain you. I'm glad it worked out that way, he added in a friendly manner. Now you are free. That's what the papers I'm handing you say. Go home and go on with your life. Home. My home is as close as Mars. Yes, home. He was silent for a moment so I could get a word in, but I was silent too. I couldn't come to my senses, and the right words wouldn't come into my head. Nevertheless, to clear my conscience, I advise you to enlist in the French army and return to normal life as a full citizen. But I hardly heard him. My thoughts were with Gals. It was as if I'd heard it in a dream. Do you agree? Yes, Mr. Lieutenant, I answered. The sound of my voice became alien. Congratulations. You've made the right decision. Sign right here. I signed without even thinking about what I was signing. You will be summoned, he said, closing the folder with my documents. Go home and try to forget about all the trouble. I was still as silent as a fish. Even the friendly lieutenant had run out of patience. He stood up and walked me to the door. Do your parents know where you are? I guess so, Mr. Lieutenant. Have you written to them? I did, Mr. Lieutenant. Then they've sent you news, too. Didn't the Boche have mail? They did, Mr. Lieutenant. My parents wrote to me, too. But we haven't heard from them in a year. He looked at me. Those bastards, he said. They wouldn't even let me send a letter. Well, off you go. Go home and try to forget all that has happened. The train whizzed past sunlit French villages. My head banged against the wooden seat back. The other passengers, those who belonged to a different world, laughed. I couldn't laugh. Nor could I forget everything that had happened to me. I looked everywhere for Gals, but I couldn't find him. I thought only of him, and it was only my habit of hiding my feelings that kept me from crying. We were united by everything we had experienced in the war. I never forgot what we had been through. In this hostile world, he was the only friend I had left. He carried my burden when my legs were stiff. I could never forget him, nor what we had to endure together, nor my fellow soldiers, whose lives are now forever linked with mine. And the train didn't stop. It carried me farther and farther away from the past. Let it travel for months, let it take me to the ends of the earth. What's the use? The memories will stay with me. Off station. With worn shoes, I step onto the cement platform. My eyes once again see the town I know so well. Nothing has changed. Everything around me is asleep. If they knew I'd arrived, they'd wake up in a flash. Everything looks the same. I'm the only one who's changed, and I know I can't go back to my old life. I stood like that for a while, looking at my surroundings. Everything seemed so small. Then I noticed 2 railroad employees staring at me. They wanted me to leave. I was the last one left on the platform. The others had long since left. Come on, said one of them. I showed him my papers. This is for the station master. Go there. The station master read my papers, understood nothing, but stamped them. Mannheim, he said. Is that where the Boche live? Not at all, I answered. It's in Germany. My accent didn't escape him. He looked at me suspiciously. Isn't it the same thing? I was still nearly 10 kilometers away from my parents' house. It was a beautiful day. I wish I could run faster with each step. I would be getting closer to home. But something squeezed my throat. I could hardly breathe. I couldn't accept that I wasn't dreaming the station I'd just seen, my town about to appear on the horizon, the ravine, the meeting with my parents, the thought of which sent chills down my spine. The despair I had felt on the Eastern Front had been replaced by a reality that I had almost completely forgotten about, and that now returned as if nothing had happened. The transition was too abrupt. I need some kind of filter. Gals, the other soldiers, the war. Everything I had to live for, all those who had died before my eyes, those without whom I would never have considered it all, seemed incompatible with what was about to happen now. I could not forget the past, I could not renounce it. I had no way out. My mind swam, as if the boat had suddenly gone down. I was on my way to the meeting I had dreamed of and now dreaded. An airplane flew low over the ground. Unable to control myself, I threw myself into the ravine on the road. The airplane circled overhead and disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. Grasping the trunk of an apple tree, I stood up, not realizing what had happened. With tired eyes, I looked at the grass, on which my footprints were imprinted. I slowly straightened up. The grass resembled uncombed hair. It was still yellow after the winter frost, and, like me, it was eager to come back to life. The grass was not tall. It reminded me of the steppe. Everything seemed familiar. I fell down again. I closed my eyes against the bright sun. Touching the earth, which alone knew what had happened to me, gave me back my confidence. I calmed down and fell asleep. Only death could put an end to everything. Hope remained, it always remains, no matter what happens. Waking up, I got up again and walked. I must have slept for hours, the sun was already setting, and when I finally reached the town, dusk was thickening. It was even better than the glow of the sun. I was dreading meeting my parents. I was all the more reluctant to run into people I used to know, and who might not have forgotten me yet, so I came home at the end of the day. I walked down the street, as if I had walked down it only yesterday. I tried to walk slowly, but each step seemed to sound like a parade in Chemnitz. I passed 2 boys. They didn't even look at me. As I turned the corner, I saw my ancestral home. My heart beat so hard it made my chest ache. Someone appeared on the corner. A short old woman with an old shawl on her shoulders. Even that shawl I knew long ago. The mother had a jug of milk in her hands. She was on her way to the neighbours, with whom I was intimately acquainted. But her path passed me. I thought I was going to faint. She was already halfway there, and I was struggling to take each step. Though my eyes darkened with emotion, I recognized her face. My heart clenched. Mother passed by. To keep from falling, I leaned against the wall. There was a bitter taste in my mouth, as if from blood. I knew that in a few minutes she would return the same way. I wanted to rush after her, but I couldn't and stood there paralyzed. A few minutes passed and she reappeared. The dusk was thickening and her figure seemed darker. She came closer and closer. I was afraid to move, afraid to frighten her. With an inhuman effort, I said, "Mummy." She froze. I took a few steps toward her and saw that she was fainting. The jug fell to the ground. I managed to hold her before she fell. Supporting my mother, I hurried to the door. Some young man appeared in it. My younger brother. Scared, he called out, "Daddy, they're taking Mummy home. She's not well." A few hours passed. My family fussed around me. They looked at me as if they had forgotten that the earth was round. Above the hearth I saw a photograph of myself as a young man and a vase of flowers. Time passed. This story was coming to an end. It would take all of us, those who waited and those who, like me, hoped a long time to come to terms with reality. I didn't want to create hardship. Those close to me need time to get used to it too. The neighbours shouldn't immediately know I'm back. It's better to keep our happiness a secret. For a few days I came to my senses and lived in my sister's room. While I was away, she got married. Time would pass and I would join the army of the victors, the French army, in which there would be a place for the former enemy. She helped me transition to a new reality. She became the filter I dreamed of. I was a despicable Boche, and by enlisting in the French armed forces, I was being honoured beyond belief. I took pleasure in what the rest of the men found only boring. I was used to discipline and had no trouble getting out first. I had to restrain myself so that the others would not be too jealous of me. I met all sorts of people. Some hated me. Others, those with a good heart, poured beer to make me forget for a while. My parents set an unspoken ban on talking about the war. I could never tell them everything that happened. I listened with rapt attention to the stories of those who performed heroic feats in the victorious army, for I will never be accepted into their ranks. Some disliked me and were always trying to put sticks in my wheels. In my past, my enemies saw only mistakes and crimes. But maybe there will be those who will realize that the enemy appreciates valor as much as we do, and suffering knows no nationality. In the ranks of the French army, in which I enlisted for 3 years, had to spend only 10 months. Although I felt fine at first, I eventually fell seriously ill and was sent home. But even before that, I had the opportunity to participate in a grand parade that took place in Paris in the 46th year. There was a moment of silence in honor of the dead. To the memory of the fallen, I will add these names: Ernst Neubach, Lenzen, Wiener, Wesridau, Prinz, Solmer, Goth, Ollensheim, Spelowski, Smellenstundi, Kellermann, Fravich, Ballers, Frosch, Wartenberg, Siemien Leys. I will never agree to include Paula's name in the list of the dead. She's not dead to me. And I will never forget the names of Gals, Lindbergh, Fergum and Wohlers. The memory of them is always with me. There is only one man I must forget forever. His name was Guy Serre.